Hi, Gary Stearman. Time for another update from Prophecy in the News today, Tuesday, February 14th. Today we're going to talk about Russia. We're going to talk about Syria, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, and the things that are happening in that region right now that strongly reflect what we've been reading in Scripture and talking about for the last few decades, if you will. Ezekiel 38:13. It mentions Sheba and Dedan in the context of an invasion of the Middle East by a huge northern army. Okay, and for years, not just we at Prophecy in the News, but virtually all reliable Bible expositors have agreed that the major foe that comes from the north against Israel will be Russia. And people have asked, how can this be? What would Russia's motivation be, and so forth. And furthermore, what would the final array look like on the battlefield? Who would be allied with whom? Who would be the enemy? Who would stand with Israel? Who would be against Israel, and so forth? And what we seem to see in Ezekiel 38 is Russia and Persia or Iran allied together in the north, and Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Israel allied together in the south. And Ezekiel 38:13 seems to confirm this. Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, that is, unto the northern invader, art thou come to take a spoil? In other words, have you come down to take loot and carry it back home, to loot us? Well, what would be the spoil that they have? It would be, I think, the huge oil fields in the Middle East that they would be raiding. And so the battle lines are set. Sheba and Dedan would be roughly the northern and southern confederation of Arab tribes. Sheba, for example, is the house of al-Sabah in Kuwait. The houses of Dedan would be the United Arab Emirates in the south and Yemen. And all of these oil-producing countries are confederate with the Western powers, referred to as the merchants of Tarshish here. And so the battle lines are drawn. Interestingly, today's news, that is the news in the last 3 or 4 days, reflects exactly this situation. Debka file. The headline, Assad wins out against opposition as Russia and Iran strengthen ties. Well, these would be the two strongest powers of the Northern Confederation, according to Ezekiel, Russia and Iran. And the story, dateline February 11th, opens, and I quote, Western intelligence sources reporting in real time found out Saturday night, February 11th, that Bashar Assad's loyal military and security forces had by and large managed to subdue the rebellion against the regime. And we've been talking about that rebellion now for weeks. The rebels on the streets of Syria are being gunned down by the Syrian army. But it now seems, according to Debka file, that Bashar Assad's troops are just about to quell the riots. Or are they? And we'll read on here in just a moment. They are now purging the last pockets of resistance, especially in Syria's third largest city called Homs, and no doubt you've been reading about that in the papers. Still to come are the possible flare-ups here and there, and inevitably more horror stories of atrocities, but to all intents and purposes, Syria's 11-month uprising is all but over. Now that is the Debka file story for February 11th, and it also mentions something we talked about last week, namely Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and SVR intelligence chief Mikhail Frodkov were delivered to the door of Assad's royal palace to make war talk. And so what we have here now is a mutual strengthening of power between Russia, Iran, and Syria. And the rebel uprising, according to this report, is being rapidly put to rest. The rebels are being killed off. So now we read a February 13th report. Saudis, and remember we talked about Saudi Arabia a minute ago, Sheba and Dedan. Saudis prompt al-Qaeda Iraq move to Syria. Assad's ouster is their top priority. the Saudis have not given up. They're still trying to knock out Syria. And we read here, Saudi rulers, seeing Bashar Assad on the verge of defeating the opposition to his rule, are reported by Debka intelligence sources as taking a hand in turning al-Qaeda Iraqi cells loose against him. And now we have another interesting power conjunction here. The Saudis and al-Qaeda have allied against Bashar al-Assad and against Ahmadinejad in Persia. So we have all kinds of lines of resistance being drawn in the Middle East. Saudi agents used their pull with Iraqi Sunnis to persuade al-Qaeda leaders that Assad and his Alawite regime were their most dangerous foes. In other words, the Saudis are trying to engineer the downfall of Bashar Assad. They are still trying it in spite of the fact that the Russians and the Iranians and Bashar Assad himself seem to have closed ranks and have withstood the uprising. The Saudis don't think so. They are now enlisting al-Qaeda to come in and to help overthrow Bashar Assad. Now, ordinarily when you think of al-Qaeda, what do you think of? You think of the long-gone leader, the one who now lies at the bottom of the sea. And you think, well, al-Qaeda is done for. Not so fast. Al-Qaeda is gaining strength. And this article that I'm reading is just one indication. The al-Qaeda network is 1,500 strong, and in Syria, and it's composed of Syrians, Egyptians, Libyans, Mauritanians, Pakistanis, Lebanese, and Palestinians. They have all come to Syria, and they are all engineering revolt or revolutionary groups that are very, very quietly fomenting revolution all over Syria. This, according to this news release, accounts for the sharp drop in terrorist attacks inside Iraq. The jihadists are making it across despite nightly battles with Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki forces, whom Tehran has ordered to block their passage, and with Syrian border guards on the other side. In other words, the news release says something very simple here, that al-Qaeda has given up in the territories where it normally holds power, and all of its forces now are converging in Syria for yet another wave of revolts against Bashar al-Assad. I thought you'd find this interesting, as I do, because it's so similar to what the Bible refers to when it speaks of a conjunction of forces in the latter days. Persia, Ethiopia, Libya, that would be the Sudan, Libya, and Egypt. Gomer and all his bands, the house of Togarmah of the north quarters, and all his bands, and many people with thee. We're seeing now this conjunction of forces take its final shape. And as we read earlier in Ezekiel 38:13, the people who are going to withstand this assault are going to be the tribes of Sheba and Dedan, allied with the merchants of Tarshish, that would be the Western powers, and Israel, and thus the battle is set. Really interesting what's happening in the Middle East today. And from one day to the next, by the way, you can hardly tell what's going on. Even the experts over there are guessing right now. But we're going to keep watching, as we always do, and we believe that as we see global power being developed along certain lines of resistance, we are seeing a biblical setting of the stage, so to speak, for the events of Bible prophecy. I'm excited about all this. The war is mounting very steadily in the Middle East, and we haven't even talked about the major forces being gathered. That would be, of course, the United States and all of its task force groups that are now arrayed over there. Keep watching. We're watching, and of course, as always, we are looking up.